the focus on doing here at Pulumi. So for folks who aren't aware, Pulumi is an infrastructure as code tool that uses existing real programming languages like TypeScript and Python and Go and .NET to manage infrastructure at scale. And recently we've done a number of interesting kind of launches. And so I was going to highlight a few of the things that came with our Pulumi Insights launch. And then maybe just demo a few things, answer any questions we have here. Probably go 30, 45 minutes, depending on how many questions and things there are that folks want to take a look at. So feel free to jump in, let us know if there's anything you want to cover here. And while we wait for some questions, I'll go ahead and just get started. So let me share my screen, and we'll maybe start by kind of looking at the blog post that we did just a few weeks ago. So here was the blog post we did on Pulumi Insights. Pulumi Insights is a set of new features we've kind of launched into the Pulumi platform that help you to sort of gain more insight over the infrastructure you're managing with Pulumi. And so, with Pulumi, you can do, search, and you can do analytics, and you can do intelligence now over all the infrastructure you're managing. And so because Pulumi is sort of this platform where you use Pulumi's infrastructure as code tools to author infrastructure and write the code that is going to generate all the infrastructure you have, that means that you kind of have a lot of information about the infrastructure you're working with in the cloud inside Pulumi. And that's across multiple different cloud providers. It's potentially doing work in AWS and Azure and GCP. Or maybe it's even just clouds and other SaaS providers. Like, we use GitHub a lot at Pulumi. And so we have resources we manage inside AWS, inside GitHub, inside a wide variety of other kind of third-party SaaS providers. And so the ability to sort of understand all of that infrastructure, gain insights on that, and learn better about how to use that is really what we're trying to go for with Pulumi Insights. So there's a couple of sort of capabilities that are part of this. Search is really the ability to go search over all that information, find the needle in the haystack, understand kind of what resources you have, and ask questions about those. Analytics is the ability to sort of go get deeper insights against some of that infrastructure. And then intelligence is some AI-based tools to help you learn and understand and iterate more quickly on ideas for new cloud capabilities. So let's go a little bit deeper into some of these. So one of the things I think we're definitely excited about, like everyone else sort of right now, we're very excited about kind of the capabilities that we can bring with sort of generative AI tools. And so Pulumi AI is sort of, kind of the first major place where we're bringing sort of generative AI experiences into infrastructure as code and into Pulumi specifically. And what we introduced was this pulumi.com/AI, which is a tool for kind of asking a question like, hey, I want to create a Cloudflare CDN for my S3 website, and getting back an answer where we get a complete piece of code in Pulumi that we can kind of go use and turn into some infrastructure as code. And so maybe, since we're here on the live stream, I'll take the opportunity to kind of go demo this a little bit, and we'll just play around with Pulumi AI, see a bit of some of the things it can do, see some of the interesting kind of limitations, and sort of how you can use those limitations as ways to sort of come up with creative new solutions to problems as well. So here we are in pulumi.com/AI. And you can see we have a few things we can do. We kind of get the prompt, and it's just sort of what cloud infrastructure would you like to build? And so we can kind of come up with any question we might have about something we want to build in the cloud. And one of the great things about using large language models and generative AI is they can be very creative. And so we can ask these questions in very indirect ways or with a lot of ambiguity in them. And the tools are going to be able to sort of come up with interesting answers. They're creative ways to solve for that problem. And if we don't like those answers, we can give them more feedback and tell them to iterate on that problem. There's a couple of interesting things we could do here. So like, the prompt it had was a static website on AWS behind a CDN. I'll just go with a simple version of that. I'll just say a static website on AWS. We also noticed that I picked TypeScript here. So I asked for it to generate the code in TypeScript, but I could have asked for other languages here as well. Now, one of the things to note is, this is coming back, and it's not super fast. As with many of the sort of more advanced large language models, there is some compute cost here. And so we're kind of running this today on GPT-4 by default, which has really good abilities to write code. But it does mean that the time it takes to kind of get back a reply is a little slower. Of course, it's still about as fast as you would be kind of typing this out yourself, or maybe even faster than that. And so still definitely a net win, but something where kind of we're looking to continue to see improvements on this or do some improvements behind the scenes ourselves. But we'll just wait for this one to finish, and then going forward, I have a couple of pre-canned examples we can just pull up to go look at as well. So you can see it gives us a short description of kind of what it's going to do to solve for this problem. And one of the things that you may be familiar with if you've seen any of these other kind of AI-based tools as well is, in general, these solutions built on top of kind of generative AI, they do a better job of answering the question if they kind of can have some time to think first. And so the first first paragraph here is laying out kind of a little bit of a thoughts on how to solve this, what resource to go use to solve this. And now they can go kind of use that and come up with some code that implements this really effectively. Now, the interesting thing to note here is in this example, we actually didn't just go ahead and use, if you had thought, how do I build a static website on AWS? You might have thought, oh, I'm going to create an S3 bucket. I'm going to set some things to make it public. I'm going to maybe put a CDN in front of it. I'm going to, put on my bucket objects and either, put those in using ISE or run some script to go copy them in from a local folder. You can imagine how you might solve for this problem. One of the interesting things is that Pulumi AI kind of thought to not just solve it in that really kind of direct way, but to solve it using a higher level component that it knows exists in the Pulumi registry, which is this AWS static website component. And that's a component which gives us a really simple high level interface to solve for this problem, where you just tell it what path, do I want a CDN, do I want logs, much higher level than building all these pieces yourself manually. And this really highlights, a couple of benefits. One, that, with Pulumi's, registry, we have a component model. And so with Pulumi generally, you don't just have to use those low-level building blocks like you might in CloudFormation or Azure Resource Manager. You can also use higher-level components, either components that you write yourself to abstract away things for what your company's doing, or in this case, something that's been published into the Pulumi registry. In this case, it's this AWS static website component. Let me just actually go over and just show that for a second. So, inside the Pulumi registry, we see we have, 137 packages available here. And it's things like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Kubernetes, the big ones, plus lots of longer tail ones, Avon, Akamai, Alibaba, so many others. But also notice there's a couple of different categories. So there's sort of providers, so native providers and providers. So this 117 of them are raw capabilities available for some cloud platform, the low-level building blocks of exposing that entire platform into Pulumi. And even just of these, there's tens of thousands of resources available across all the different cloud providers, and I think over 1 million properties that you can configure against these providers. But there's also another category here, which is components. And these are sort of higher level libraries that take common patterns and make them easier to accomplish with Pulumi. And these are things you can just consume from code. If you want to write these, you consume these in TypeScript or in Python or in Go or in .NET. You can kind of use these from any code that you might write, just as you would any other class or component within your programming language. But you can see these are all the kind of things we have currently in this static website. I forget where the AWS one was, but AWS static website. Here it is. So this is that component that we saw being used in that Pulumi AI example. So we can come in here. We can see all the resources on this. The UCDN should be in here somewhere. These are all with CDN, with logs, these are the properties it was using in that example. Now, the thing to really note is that in here, the reason why it was able to get this right and know that this component was going to be part of the solution is because Pulumi AI is sort of fundamentally connected up to the registry. So as well as being built on top of GPT-4 APIs, it's also built on top of the Pulumi registry. And so it will go out, check for whether it thinks there's any resources in the registry that will help to solve for the question that you had originally. And then it will give that as context into the generative AI, along with your query and along with some guidance around how to solve your problem in a way that's going to really help you get to a complete and working example. And we tune that all so that it will have up-to-date access to exactly the latest things that are available inside the registry, so they can write correct code that use the best resources for this problem. And so, a number of folks have asked, hey, how is this different than ChatGPT, for example? And while ChatGPT can do a pretty good job writing code and even writing Pulumi code, it doesn't have that connection to the registry. So it often will use very old versions of APIs or not know about recent versions or hallucinate the API shapes. generally make quite a few mistakes in terms of how it constructs the programs. We can help it to do a much better job by integrating it with the registry, like we've done with Pulumi AI. I see there's one question that came in. I'll just kind of answer that while we're in the flow here. So there's a question from Josh about, can Pulumi AI help to write new providers? So that's a great question. There's sort of two sides to that. One, when I was over in the registry, I kind of mentioned there was two different types of providers that we have available. There's sort of provider packages and component packages. And for provider packages, those are written in a very different way than a normal Pulumi program. Those are written as just an implementation of create, read, update, and delete operations for a given resource. And today, Pulumi AI is not, designed to kind of help with that problem. Maybe something we tackle in the future to kind of help it to identify that need and help to solve for that as well. But generally, that problem is more about just mapping your cloud provider into Pulumi's resource model, and it's a very different kind of challenge. For those component packages, though, for building something like this AWS static website component, in many ways, this is exactly how you do it. Is just kind of ask, how do you solve this problem? It will give you back some code, and then you can just put it within a component resource. And so that sort of thing, how do I solve this problem? How do I put that in a component? Is definitely something that Pulumi AI can do. Maybe actually when we look at one of the next examples, I'll see if we can kind of go and play with this and see if we can iterate in that direction. Yeah, so this is actually an interesting example here that I pulled up earlier. And one of the things to note actually, by the way, is we have this ability to share a conversation. And so if you've come up with an interesting result, you can just copy the link, come over here, paste it, and that whole conversation is here. So anyone who you share that link with can go see the conversation you had. That means you can kind of, if you come up with an interesting example, you can record it for your own purposes. You can send it to your teammates. You can kind of share these things around. So I think that's a really helpful way to be able to reuse some of these as well. But this was an interesting example where I kind of asked it a couple of questions. So one was create an AWS S3 bucket resource. Of course, it just comes up with this very simple thing here. But then if I want to say something like, hey, now show me how to do that in Azure. And this is sort of that lateral creative thinking. It may not be obvious exactly what that question means. There isn't an AWS.S3.bucket resource in Azure, right? That's an AWS specific thing. But it comes up with, say, what would be the closest equivalent to that concept within Azure? And then how do I use that using the Azure APIs? It even knows, if you go back over to the registry, we have Azure Native as the default provider for Azure, whereas AWS Classic is the default provider for AWS in our platform. And so if I look at this, it knows to kind of go use Azure Native. It knows to go create a storage account. It knows the APIs and that I need to kind of pass a SKU here, which is sort of a concept that didn't exist inside AWS. And so it kind of knows how to be creative about solving for that problem. But let's actually try an interesting thing here and see. Let me come back to maybe this one. Where was it? Let me see if I can find that one again. Because one thing I wanted, that's not the same example. Well, I'll go play around with that with a different example in a second, but I'll just let this go while I'm running with it. Cool. I'll just mention a couple other things while we're here. We can also do the same thing kind of within that static website example. We can do the same thing within other languages as well. So, here is one where I did it for Go instead. And it came up with sort of a way to solve for that problem, but using Go. And so the ability to write code in any of these languages, because the large language models are trained on an enormous amount of TypeScript and Python and Go and C# and Java code, even outside of using those languages for infrastructure as code use cases, they just have seen enormous amounts of this code because they're the most popular languages in the world. These tools are extremely good at writing code that's correct in these languages, whereas for DSLs or other YAML formats, they've seen an order of magnitude or 2 or 3 orders of magnitude less code, and so they're less good at being creative in those systems and correct than they are within these languages. And so in some ways, these tools are actually better at writing cloud infrastructure using these languages and Pulumi because they're trained so well on code in these languages. Now, I know there's another question here about, can Pulumi AI service be ported to air-gapped environments? And so, that's a great question. So today, what we're offering here is just a free service, pulumi.com/AI. So anyone can come up and use this. But it is just something that we're running as a service kind of in the Pulumi website. Some of the key technology that's part of this is also available in a Node.js project. But that thing is not using some of the latest abilities to sort of reach into the registry and those sorts of pieces that require it to be connected into Pulumi service itself. We do hope to kind of make this available as a capability that can run within the Pulumi service as well, so that anyone kind of using Pulumi Cloud, so for folks who aren't aware, kind of Pulumi has a product offering, Pulumi Cloud here, that offers sort of a broad view over all your infrastructure as code that you're managing with Pulumi. And you are expecting to kind of integrate some of this experience into Pulumi Cloud so that you can use it along with your infrastructure. So if you have your own components that are part of your private infrastructure that you manage internally at your company, you can use those and have the AI get trained on those and be able to kind of go see how to use those as part of the solution instead of just using the things that are in our public registry. So a lot of things I think we're looking to integrate into this. And then we do have a version of this Pulumi Cloud offering that you can run self-hosted and run even in an air-gapped environment. You would technically be able to do that, except you would need to be able to plug in kind of a large language model. And today we work with GPT-4, which of course is only available in a hosted form. But in principle, in the future, we may be able to kind of do that with a model that we're running locally inside the service itself. So air-gapped is not really, for a few reasons, it's not really something you can do today with this service. But directionally in the future, it's something that we're definitely working towards. Okay, let me bring up a couple other examples here. So, this one is a meaningfully more kind of complex example in a sense of, I asked it to run Metabase on AWS with a managed Postgres database. And so, here it came up with, did it in Python in this case, came up with this, pretty long example here. It uses, about a dozen different services inside AWS, figures out how to kind of map them all together in interesting ways, make sure to, expose it publicly to the internet, connect it up to those endpoints. But it also, interestingly, and this is the sort of thing that, you wouldn't find typically in sort of an example that you just found online. It knows, because of Metabase, me mentioning Metabase, it knows some specific things about that. Like it knows that it's running on port 3000 by default. It probably guessed some things about the CPU and memory kind of based on that thing. It knows all the environment variables that Metabase needs me to pass and how to hook those up to sort of match the infrastructure that it's building. So able to be very creative about how to kind of solve this end-to-end problem in a way that makes sense. And so it gives me this, fairly significant piece of code here as well. So one of the things we could do if we have some time, I'll answer a couple of questions first, but then maybe I'll try to, taking this code over and seeing if we can play around with it inside our IDE. But there's a couple other questions here. One was, what is the current most popular language within the Pulumi ecosystem? I am planning on debating between using TypeScript and Python. Well, I'll say that, the TypeScript and Python are both very popular today. I think, TypeScript was the first language that we supported back when we first started, and I think in part because of that, it's I think it's been the highest used since then. But Python has grown very fast, and I think is probably the fastest growing still in terms of languages. And I think over time we're likely to see that kind of that and TypeScript both end up being very popular. Go is popular more so with sort of teams that are building for building components in a sense, and there's reusable pieces of infrastructure where the end consumers of that within the company are TypeScript or Python users, but they're able to build reusable components in Go, and just Go gives them some additional tools to just make sure that those components are really robust and make sure they have a very simple binary for distribution and things. And then C#, of course, there's just, there's a community of folks who really want to use C# or using full stack kind of C# applications, and, C# fits really well into the organization. So I'd say, we support all these languages. We try to make sure that, the vast majority of features are available across all of these in a consistent way. But TypeScript and Python probably are definitely the two highest, and probably of those, TypeScript has the largest kind of set of support, but both are very heavily supported. Yeah, and Kevin mentions kind of using both, and I think we do see a lot of that. One of the interesting things is I was commenting to some folks recently. We've seen actually a whole bunch of companies sort of in the AI and AI tooling spaces and building the infrastructure projects around AI who have been picking up Pulumi recently and using it. And we've seen of that cohort definitely some bias towards Python from those users because they're, that ecosystem tends to be a bit more Python focused. And so because they're Python focused from an application development perspective, they bring that over into their infrastructure as well. And so we've definitely seen kind of some upticks around that ecosystem, whereas maybe for some of the more cloud native customers who we've had, they're leaning a bit more Go, and the more sort of enterprise customers leaning C#. So kind of some of the things you might expect. But really the overarching thing being folks picking a language that their organization already uses, has tools, has practices built up around, and now they get to benefit from all of those practices and tools for their cloud infrastructure as well as their application development. There was also a question about any plans to integrate more platform support for Oracle Cloud. Actually curious kind of what the sort of question there specifically is, because we obviously do have an Oracle Cloud provider. So if I come over to the registry again, we just leave this open. It can come over to Oracle. We do have an Oracle Cloud infrastructure provider. It has, as you can see here, quite a lot of resources, and each one of these is a module. Each one of these has a half dozen resources. So I have a very large provider for the Oracle platform. It's not as heavily used, as probably isn't surprised, as AWS and Azure. But we do have a number of users using this kind of in production and benefiting a lot from having access to this from Pulumi. So definitely, for Oracle Cloud folks, we encourage them to use Pulumi. But if there's any specific things they're missing, definitely interested in feedback on that. And there's another question along these same lines about, based on customer usage, which major cloud providers are you being used on? And yeah, I think, Pulumi is used really across the board. I mean, one of the things that, we love is just being a very horizontal platform that can support any cloud projects that you have. And whether that's, we have a number of customers who actually work with multiple clouds at once. Kind of mentioned some, platform tools in the AI space and the data space. And many of them are offering solutions where you can run, as a user of their platform, you can go run that in in a cloud environment. So you can run it close to your own infrastructure. And so they actually let you go spin up your own environment in GCP or in Azure or in AWS or even in Oracle Cloud. And because of that, they need to be able to manage infrastructure across all those different clouds in a very consistent way. And we see that pattern as something where people are picking up Pulumi and using it very heavily when they have a sort of fundamentally multi-cloud use case. But we see kind of a wide breadth, very long tail of provider usage as well. But probably no surprise, our usage probably matches what you'd see in terms of just overall cloud adoption surveys and things. AWS is still, I think the most heavily used, but Azure, Google Cloud, a lot of Kubernetes, all of these are platforms that are being used heavily with Pulumi. All right, well, since we have the ability to kind of do some demos here, why don't I just come in, we'll grab this code and we'll just sort of play around with it inside an ID here. So let me just come over, let's make a directory for demo metabase. And let me just run Pulumi new to create a new project here. So this is going to be, we're running this in AWS and running this in Python. So let me just pick up the AWS Python. I'll just create a new empty project here. We'll run it a little closer to me. So go ahead and create the environment for us. Take a couple of seconds to install all the dependencies. There we go. Now let's just open up our IDE and we'll just play around with it a little bit. So we see that we got here. Just open up a terminal as well. We see here we got a simple Python project that got created when we did that Pulumi new. Bump up the font a little bit. And it's just a normal Python project. We got the requirements.txt. We've got our main.py. We've even got our virtual environment that we set up automatically. And the default code I got was just this. But let's take that code that we saw on screen here and just bring it over and see kind of what happens here. So we do see that there's a couple of interesting errors. And so you will see that periodically the Pulumi AI tool does make some mistakes. It's an interesting mistake here where it just sort of missed missed the equals and quote character there. But then a couple of other mistakes it made. So this key value pair args if you don't know what this is supposed to be. Let's see what Metabase env says. So it made some interesting kind of challenges there. But one of the things I'll kind of come and just find one of the maybe the mistakes it made here. Let's go see. So Metabase env is used. I think we don't even have to do this at all, do we? I think it thought we had to kind of put this into a. It's actually an interesting question. I don't know what the type of this thing needs to be. So we're passing it to container definitions. So let's go find container definitions here. Okay, so it looks like what container definitions actually wants is this. So why don't we go to see what happens though? We'll look at the problems here. And I don't know if it'll be able to answer this. Well, here's one that maybe is actually interesting. So it says cannot access the member endpoint port from type instance. And so why don't I just copy this? Come back over here and we'll say that gave me an error. And you fixed it. Maybe I'll paste that just in text. There we go. So I'll paste that in, hit enter. And we'll see that now it'll try to answer kind of this question as a follow-up. So it has all the context about what this program was and what it generated last time. But now it'll think about how to go solve that problem for us. And so here you'll see it's kind of working on that. And it says based on the error, it seems the endpoint port is an unknown member. Instead, you should use the port property. This is an interesting thing where it was able to fix that problem, even though it made the mistake initially. Once it sort of focused in on that problem that we had and on that particular type, now it can actually go use the Pulumi registry to look up that specific resource property and use that to go understand how to fix the problem. And so even though it won't always, and it even left a comment here to help me get that right. But even though it won't always get everything 100% right, you can actually use it as a tool to iterate on these things. And you notice it also sort of knew to not go regurgitate the entire rest of this, just kind of re-gave us the snippet that it's going to need to replace this with. So really, really sort of creative and helpful way to do that. And you can kind of iterate with these other problems if the code it generates doesn't do exactly what you want. Okay, so that was a few examples of Pulumi AI, and if there's any other kind of questions or things people would like to try out, feel free to send them over, but also feel free to just try out Pulumi AI at pulumi.com/AI as well. I did want to touch on a few of the other capabilities that were part of the Insights launch. So one, which I won't demo live here because it takes a little bit longer to kind of run through this, but I'll just show this video and kind of talk to what's happening here for a second. We also, with Pulumi AI, launched a CLI tool. You can run npx pulumi-ai to run this tool. You need to have Pulumi installed, and you do need a OpenAI token locally to use the GPT APIs. But you'll see that kind of what it lets you do is just kind of write things that you would like to do. So, for example, the first, if I go back to the beginning of this thing, I'll just wait for it to go back to the beginning. If I go back to the beginning, you see I just will say, I want an S3 bucket. And it doesn't just give me the code, it goes and actually creates that. And so you see in the output, it just said created, and then it gives me the output. And so this is a way to think about how we can potentially start using these AI tools, not just to give us code that we can paste back into our applications, but to actually iterate on infrastructure along with the AI assistant. So the AI assistant in this case has access to some AWS credentials, is able to go deploy on my behalf into a sandbox environment. And able to go create infrastructure based on the requests I have and iterate on that infrastructure, build up a real piece of software running on the internet that has a publicly addressable IP. So really sort of interesting beginnings of ideas for how we go kind of leverage these tools. In this case, leveraging Pulumi Automation API to allow us to create infrastructure using AI. But then kind of shifting gears, I mentioned at the beginning the search capabilities, and this is a capability that's I think really exciting, is the ability to kind of go search across all the infrastructure you're managing and find things that are potentially interesting for you. And so let me just jump over into app.pulumi.com and show off a little bit about how search works in practice. And this will be a little bit behind the scenes. I have my own sort of personal org and this little demo org for upstarts, but they don't have a ton of resources in them. These are just things I use for demos, and so they don't have the thousands of resources that make sort of search really exciting for larger scale users. And so I'm going to show this actually in our Pulumi org. Probably not surprising that we use Pulumi heavily at Pulumi. And so, for example, Pulumi service testing, this is actually the app.pulumi.com testing environment itself, which is being managed with Pulumi. But you can see a number of other things that we're kind of actively working on. All of these are just in the last 30 minutes updates that we've done inside Pulumi against our infrastructure. But we can also come over here and just search across different things that we're managing. And so first thing you notice in search is I immediately get back overview of all the resources that I'm managing. So we have 45,500 or so resources in the various cloud providers that we're managing kind of at Pulumi in this organization. But then I can also, with this advanced filtering, come in and see a bunch of interesting aggregates over my data. And so this kind of tells you, what types of resources, what projects, what teams, what packages. So what are all the different cloud providers? And if I want to go even further, I can say view more and see kind of a much more detailed link to this list of this. So for packages, we can see, obviously, we're using AWS pretty heavily. We're also using GitHub, AWS X, Snowflake, our own Pulumi service. We're coordinating that. We have a provider for managing Pulumi Cloud itself. And a bunch more. So, kind of a long tail here, but this is pretty common for a lot of our customers, that they're using quite a few of the packages in a number of different interesting forms. And we can come in here and sort of look, well, what are we doing with Docker, for example, right? And so, here's all the usages. I'll just clear these filters. Nope. I wanted to actually go in there. So if I come down, I can see, these are all the resources that we're managing in with Docker, and I can actually come in and go look at one of these and find out some information about it. So for example, I could come over here, click on this, and I get all the details of this resource itself. So I get the logs from the last build of this. I get, all the properties on the resource, like where it's being stored in ECR, the Docker file that was used to build it, kind of all this additional information. So I can go kind of get information, find things that I care about, answer questions about my infrastructure in a really natural and simple way. We can also dive in on a bunch of other dimensions as well. So if I clear those filters again and come back, I can find, what are all the things I have in my staging environment, or what are all the things I have in testing? How the fact that staging is so much smaller than production, like maybe I focus this down just on our Pulumi service, and I can see the relative size of each of these environments. So it's interesting, one of our developers, Casey, looks like, her dev stack is particularly large. I might be curious, kind of, hey, is there a cost implication of that? What is the sort of thing that she's doing that is new there, and could kind of go look into that from here. We can also see the sort of resources that we're working with on this. Now, you have access to a whole bunch of information, both this sort of high-level information about the projects and stacks and types and modules, that sort of thing, but then also sort of a ton of additional metadata. So for example, we can clear this out and do something like go look at the protected. Filter on that. I can just filter on protected : true, and we see that there's 539 resources that we have that are protected. And these are going to be things that, really we have to make sure not to destroy, like our CloudFront distributions, our records, our buckets, probably some databases will be in here. And so these are all resources that are using Pulumi's protected feature, which allows you to mark a resource as something that cannot be destroyed unless you explicitly remove the protect bit first and then run a destroy. And so it's just a protection measure to make sure that you can't accidentally destroy these using Pulumi. You have to do it very intentionally as sort of a multi-step process. And so we might have an audit we want to do of, hey, are all of our databases protected? We could easily use this to kind of go do that sort of analysis. So quite a lot of things that we can do here. There's also another fun feature that kind of takes this AI piece further. So we can go in the AI assist here and say, give me all my buckets across all cloud. And I can type this in natural language because we're sort of using the AI assist. And when we do the search, it'll turn it into a query in kind of the Pulumi search syntax that probably would have taken me a little while to figure out and type in. But it comes up with a really creative answer to this question, right? It guesses that means AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. And it comes up with the type names for each of those. So it knows that the type name for that is AWS S3 bucket. in AWS, it's Google Storage Bucket in Google Cloud, and it's Azure storage account in Azure. So kind of that ability to connect into these data sources, understand the schema, and come up with a query that gives me the resources I need. And of course, it does that even though we only use, we don't use the storage bucket storage accounts ourselves. It's able to come up with that as well. Okay, I see there's a couple of questions, so let me kind of go back and answer a few of those. And if there's any more coming in on questions, let me know, and I'm happy to answer those as well. So the next one was, what's the best way to ask for features for the Pulumi AI CLI tool? So I'd say for this, you can, that repo is open source. So for the CLI tool, you can come over here to Pulumi AI. I think I have that open, yeah. So this is that tool that, same screenshot GIF here that we were just looking at in the blog post. This one is a bit more experimental, as we note here, and probably something that we're going to iterate on in meaningful ways. But you can jump in here, use this, open up issues, submit pull requests. Definitely happy to have folks iterate and start using this and playing around with it. So yeah, no, check that out for sure. And then, will the Pulumi AI CLI be written in other languages? No, we have no intention of kind of writing this in multiple languages. Really, for this tool, the language written is mostly not, kind of something that you should have to worry about per se. It's mostly just a CLI tool. Most likely over time, we'll kind of integrate this into the Pulumi CLI or other experiences directly. And so we might rewrite it in Go just as part of being part of the Pulumi CLI. It's ultimately, not a terribly complex tool, and I think it'll eventually integrate more into the backend service that we're running with Pulumi AI. It's more kind of a thought experiment to play around with some of these integration ideas. What happens if you combine automation API with these AI tools? And so something that we're going to take these ideas, continue to iterate on them, and probably integrate them into other experiences. But today we're not going to go just rewrite this tool as is into any other languages. Cool. All right. Well, then, kind of the last thing from the blog post that's worth, it's a bunch of interesting examples of more complex queries that I didn't even get to. Actually, this one's worth showing because I think it's sort of interesting. I guess this was an example query, but not one that we ourselves use. But this is an example where we're kind of using more advanced queries where we can say modified after this date. And so, you can do the query syntax here, and we have a link over to this documentation that tells you how to use this. But this query syntax is quite advanced, lets you do some really interesting queries over your resources. And so even things like finding recently modified things, finding things that have been not modified recently that you might want to go make sure are still up to date, that sort of thing. So quite a lot of queries you can ask for. We showed off some of the AI assist for search, which I think is really exciting, just because some of the most interesting queries you can ask. The syntax for writing those is a little bit something you have to go learn. One of the best ways to learn is just ask the question in natural language and have it come back and tell you how to do that using the search syntax. One of the questions we got all the time when we sort of started working with some customers on resource search was, hey, it's great I can do this over my existing Pulumi resources, the things I've managed with Pulumi and with infrastructure as code in Pulumi. But what about all my other infrastructure that I maybe point and clicked 2 years ago, and now it's running and I need it and it's really important, but it's not going to be in Pulumi in the near term? Can I use resource search over that as well? And we actually do have a preview thing. You can join a waitlist to gain access to this. But a cloud import feature, which will allow you to provide some sort of access credentials for us to reach out into your cloud provider or your cloud provider account, and then have this sort of pull in virtual resources, which are a resource in Pulumi, but that isn't managed with Pulumi. And so you can use that virtual resource to get all the benefits of search, to get all the understanding of what you're managing across all your clouds, but not have to actually have a Pulumi program that defines that infrastructure. And so definitely a useful thing. We support kind of AWS and Azure with this today. This is actually built on top of our Pulumi deployments capability, which is our ability to run infrastructure projects on your behalf. And with Cloud Import, we're actually using that behind the scenes to run a little project which does an import and imports all your resources in as part of that job. So some really interesting pieces there that we can go into more if folks are interested. And then the last piece I'd say is kind of this analytics piece. And again, when we kind of talk to people about search, I think a lot of people said, hey, this search experience is amazing, but what I really want is to get access to all that data so that I can then go kind of combine it with the other sources of data I have that give me a really interesting way to gain deeper insights into my infrastructure, because I can combine it with departmental data or cost data or whatever else it is that I have in my data warehouse, for example. And so many different questions. We heard a bunch of these from kind of customers who we talked to, and you can see here, kind of some of the examples. This is just an example dashboard. The font on this is a little bit slow. Let me see if I can. It's a little bit better. This is the dashboard that we built. This was in Metabase, but it's using a bunch of data that we were kind of put in Snowflake, including all the resource data from Resource Search. And so, for example, if I come back into here, maybe clear this search off, you'll see that I have the ability to download CSV. So I can download a CSV of all these 46,000 resources, or we have an API that you can integrate with to pull that data out kind of on a cron job or send it to wherever you want to kind of integrate it with your other solutions. But we then, had a tool that builds and pushes that kind of into Snowflake so that we can write some interesting queries. And things like count of resources by type. We did that query about how many resources are protected, but I can now put that on a dashboard widget. All of these things like this. And one of the notable things is this is not now inside the Pulumi cloud offering. This is just something I've put inside my own, my own dashboarding tools that I might use inside my organization. We do over time kind of imagine that we'll probably go take some of these experiences and embed them directly into Pulumi Cloud, giving you the ability to do some analytics over that as well. Cool. Well, that's sort of a kind of conclusion of the core features of Pulumi Insights. But certainly happy to go kind of talk about any other pieces of Pulumi if folks are interested. The one thing I will kind of plug here is we do have a Pulumi Up conference next week. So for folks who want to learn about a whole bunch of additional new things that we're going to be launching throughout the week next week and talking about in depth at Pulumi Up, definitely encourage you to come join us at the Pulumi Up conference on Thursday next week. You can register right here. And we're going to have a whole bunch of additional cool demos and new features and talking about some of the other things going on at Pulumi. So definitely come join us. That's it for me. If there's any last questions, I'll answer them. But otherwise, I'll say thank you all very much for joining us, and join us next time at Pulumi Up. See you all later.